Alrighty, so since we have a pretty packed agenda today, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this exciting webinar today, New Jersey Sharks and Their Habitats. My name is Lily, and I work for the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey, and we are co-hosting this event with Monmouth University. So this webinar was intended to kick off the start of Shark Week, but there apparently was a last-minute change to the event's dates. So let's just say we're getting a head start on celebrating Shark Week with this webinar. Today, we will be hearing from two guest speakers, Dr. Keith Dunton of Monmouth University and Adrianna Zito-Livingston of the Nature Conservancy. Dr. Keith Dunton is an associate professor in the biology department at Monmouth University. Keith is fish ecologist working in the mid-Atlantic for the last 20 years on a variety of fish species. His current research involves using acoustic telemetry to track the movements, migration, and behaviors of sharks, sturgeons, and other fishes. Adrianna Zito-Livingston serves as the Climate Adaptation Project Manager for the Nature Conservancy's New Jersey chapter. She's an ecologist, conservation practitioner, and project manager with over a decade of experience in biological monitoring and restoration of coastal habitats. Adrianna's work extends from site selection and project development efforts through evaluating and communicating project results. She focuses on innovative restoration practices that play to nature's strength, something we'll be learning about more in this presentation. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Oops, next slide, perfect, thanks. So before we begin, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We have enabled closed captions and live translations for this webinar. To access them, select the closed caption button towards the bottom of your screen. We also have enabled the Q&A feature for this webinar, so please feel free to add your questions to that component. There will be time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A, so feel free to add your questions as the presentation goes on. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and we plan to upload it to our YouTube channel. We will also be sending a link to the recording in a follow-up email sometime next week. And with all of that out of the way, let's turn it over to Dr. Keith Dunton to learn more about the sharks of New Jersey and how New Jersey's coastal wetlands and back bays play important roles in their life cycles.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. I'll be talking a little bit about some of the shark species that we encounter pretty regularly along the New Jersey coast, and some of the ones in particular that are really important for our shallow water estuaries and marsh systems. Most of the shark research I've been doing in New Jersey over the last 7 years or so has revolved around land-based shark fishing, and this is shark fishing from shore in a variety of locations along the Jersey coast. And here, pictured here, is a sandbar shark that we had caught, and we are surgically implanting an acoustic telemetry tag in. A lot of my research involves tagging and using all different types of technologies and tagging methodologies in order to look and examine various things such as movements and migrations, behavior, understanding mortality of sharks, and as well as looking at potential population estimates or populations. So looking at this shark fin here, you can see all sorts of tags attached to it. These yellow ones here are conventional tags. This is what would get reported by a fisherman or an angler or someone that caught or captured an animal, and that gives us like a point estimate of the shark was recaptured here or there. Most of my work revolves around this, which is an acoustic telemetry tag. We surgically implant it into the animal, and it kind of acts like a little easy pass system for fish as it moves through the ecosystem. If it passed by one of these receivers, it gets detected and time stamped. And those tags are really great for species like sharks because they can last for up to 10 years. The other tag pictured here is another tag we use called a pop-off archival tag or satellite tag that gets deployed on the external side of an animal and gets moving around and eventually pops off and transmits to the satellite the information that we're trying to collect. Those tags are a little bit more short-termed or more short duration, anywhere between 30 or up 30 days or up to a year, but they're great for understanding things like mortality. So we use a combination of those approaches to look at the various animals. And here's a spiny dogfish with an external tag that we have. A lot of my research along the Jersey coast, land-based, has encountered all sorts of shark species over the years, but most of them are dominated by this shark here, which is the sand tiger shark, as well as the sandbar shark, which I'll describe a little bit later. But these two shark species are the ones we encounter most along the coast. They're coastal sharks, and they're are important because they use our bays and estuaries as nursery grounds, which we'll explain later. And some of these other sharks that we encounter are species that are more seasonal migrants. So we have lots and lots and lots of different shark species along the Jersey coast, way more than are pictured here, but we kind of classify them, or I can classify them into kind of three groups or categories. These are our small coastal sharks, which include our dogfishes and Atlantic sharpnose. They don't get very big, maybe up to 5 feet in length, but are mostly coastal bottom sharks. The smooth dogfish, which we'll get into a little bit later, is a really important estuarine animal. Then we have our large coastal sharks here. These sharks migrate up and down the coast in very shallow water, but can occur offshore as well. This is our sandbar, our sand tiger, and our dusky. The sandbars and sand tigers do utilize our bays and estuaries a lot, in particular as nursery grounds and key foraging areas. And then we have our pelagic sharks, our blue, our thresher, our mako, and our white shark would be classified in here. These are animals that utilize the water column for most of their feeding and activity. This would also include animals like whale sharks as well. And we do see all sorts of other species, spinners and black tips and hammerheads as well along our coast. But the one thing that's important with all these shark species as a whole, they have very low natural mortality rates, and most of them are really old animals, and they tend to be large, long-lived animals. Globally, these sharks and animals, most shark species have showed large declines in their populations. And this is just a representative sample from a variety of papers that show major declines over the years. And this is largely due to overfishing or things like bycatch as well. This is important because a lot of these sharks play key roles in our ecosystems, particularly as keeping the ecosystems in check. So in ecosystems where we have small sharks, we have a much more shorter or shortened food chain, and in healthy ecosystems where we have a variety of sharks, apex predators and meso predators, we can get more complicated food chains, which all leads to the biodiversity of these systems. Most of the sharks that we encounter here in New Jersey, at least the ones that we encounter close to our coast, the sandbar and sand tiger, are what we classify as a prohibited shark species. These sharks are prohibited largely because of their life history trace, meaning you can't land them or harvest them. These animals can be split up into what we call ridgeback sharks and non-ridgeback sharks. So the ridgeback shark, which includes the sandbar shark and dusky, have this long kind of ridge along down their back that we can visibly see. But our other non-ridgeback sharks include our white shark, our angel shark, and our sand tiger shark. One of the key reasons why a lot of these shark species are prohibited is because of their life history traits. Most of these species are really long-lived, 20 to 50 years of age. They have a late age of maturity. Some of the animals don't reproduce until into their late teens. They have known migrations, which makes fishing for them very easy. So a lot of them follow most fish migrations, which is north and south. North during the spring and south during the fall. Their habitat is really close to shore, and they have really low reproductive outputs, or they produce very little young. And in addition to that, they may not lay their young every year like a lot of fish species do. So most fish or fin fish, like our striped bass or black sea bass or the fish along our coast, have external fertilization, external development. So they can lay lots and lots and lots of eggs along the coast, and which can lead to a lot of individuals. Sharks, skates, and rays have internal fertilization. So here's a male shark here. This is a female shark here. The males have these modified pelvic fins that have claspers, where they have internal fertilization, and they may have internal development or external development. So if you find these little mermaid purses along the shore, that's probably a winter skate, but some sharks can lay egg cases as well. Because they have internalization, they produce very few young. This is the uterus of a shark. They actually have 2 uteri, and we can see the developing shark pups inside. This is of a nurse shark here. This right here is a spiny dogfish with an egg yolk still attached. So even though they develop inside the female sharks, they can develop based on its egg yolk, or they can actually have what we call a yolk sac placenta, so they can have a direct connection to the mom. So they produce very few individuals during this time. So this all makes them vulnerable. So today I'll just kind of touch on some of the 3 key shark species that we find in our New Jersey estuaries: sand tiger, smooth dogfish, sandbar shark, and then I also thought I'd touch a little bit on white shark because a lot of people are interested in that. Plus, we are home to one of the key white shark nurseries along the East Coast. So the first species I talk about is the smooth dogfish. This is probably one of the most, this will probably be a species that we interact with most. We call them dogfish because sometimes we find them in really big schools, or sometimes they hunt in big packs like dogs. They're fairly small. They get up to about 5 feet in length, and they kind of look like their counterpart, which is the spiny dogfish. The only difference is the spiny dogfish have these white dots, and then they have these poisonous spines on them. These spiny dogfish tend to be offshore a little bit, whereas the smooth dogfish rely on our estuaries and nurseries. These individuals range from the Bay of Fundy down to South America, and they are most common from Cape Cod to Delaware. And they do have seasonal migrations, just like many of the shark species that we have for the north and south. Here's a smooth dogfish we caught on one of our Monmouth university trips. One of the key things that we also see that distinguishes smooth dogfish, they have these very large, kind of gold, really cool eyes with a very large spherical. These animals are also very different compared to other sharks. When we look at their jaws, they have very small, blunt teeth. And these teeth are not very sharp at all. They're actually quite smooth to the touch compared to, say, our sandbar shark, which has very sharp, triangular teeth. So just by looking at the jaws, we know that they're not like other sharks. They're not going to be preying and shredding fish species for the most part. So what we do know is because of their teeth are really round, it's more crushing and blunt. So they're opportunistic predators preying on things like shrimps, crabs, polychaetes, um, the most. So they like to utilize our shallow water estuaries, such as like Great Bay, because those areas tend to be loaded with crabs and sandworms and polychaetes and little grass shrimp. So it's a very abundant prey resource in those shallow water estuary habitats. Um, they're and they tend to be nocturnal predators as well, with that big eye that they have. Smooth dogfish in general um, live up to about 16 years for females, 10 years for males, and they do mature fairly quickly, about 2 to 3 years of age. And they can have about 4 to 20 pups, depending on the size of the female. And they'll give birth within our natal estuaries in the late spring, early summer. Their gestation period is very similar to ours, about 10 to 11 months. So even though they may give birth to 420 pups, it takes them about 10 months gestation period with inside the mom. So these pups occur along our coast, and you'll find them very abundant within our shallow water estuaries as well. So here's a recently born pup that we captured down in Cape May. And once these sharks are in these shallower estuaries, they will eat, grow, develop, where they'll then immigrate out the system. But that's not without having said that they are prey for other shark species, particularly our sand tiger sharks and our sandbar sharks do eat them quite often. This is a picture from University of Delaware, where they were conducting a long line survey for sand tiger sharks. And you can see a smooth dogfish had originally bit the hook, and then the sand tiger had then eaten the smooth dogfish. So a perfect segue into our next shark, which is our sand tiger shark. This is a species that we consider a cosmopolitan species, meaning it occurs on lots of different coasts. And worldwide, the populations have been reduced by 70 to 90%. These species, most people are familiar with because you see them a lot in aquariums. They're perfect for aquariums because they're slow, they're docile, and they tend to kind of hover in this position. These animals can live up to 40 years of age and get upwards of 10 feet in length. They're very distinguishable from other sharks because they have these little spots along their body. They have very small, tiny eyes, and they have that really distinguished, ragged teeth, very sharp, long teeth sticking out, which they use to capture fish. One of the key things, one of the cool things about sand tigers is that they're known to gulp air to remain neutrally buoyant. So if you ever see a sand tiger just kind of floating in the aquarium, just hovering above the bottom, it's because they have just enough air in their system to remain neutrally buoyant. This gives them a predatory advantage of hovering above the surface of the sediment to eat some of their key prey resources, such as smooth dogfish or rays or some of the bottom fish that we see. These animals are also a little bit more unique because they do form these really big aggregations, and they travel together or can travel together in groups. This is really prevalent or dominant in some of the offshore wrecks in North Carolina where they overwinter. And they could just kind of hang out within these wrecks in these very large numbers. I like this graphic a lot. This is from Danielle Halsey, who was at University of Delaware. She made kind of a social media page for some of her tagged sharks. But we can see that with these two tagged sharks here, that they encountered a lot of other sand tiger sharks, which supports their migratory behavior. But they also encounter the same sharks over and over again. So there's their mutual friends. So they've encountered 151 similar or same sharks with their tags, as well as a lot of the same individuals that they encounter over and over again. So kind of cool when you think about their behavior. These animals mature, particularly the females, about 7 feet and 9 years of age. The males are a little bit smaller, around 6 feet and 7 years. And they tend to only give birth to 1 or 2 juveniles at the same time. But these juveniles are really big, about 3 feet long and fully developed. They are very, very unique because they practice something called inner uterine cannibalism. So what happens is one shark pup develops a little bit faster than its brothers and sisters. So here's a bigger juvenile, and then there's one of its smaller brothers and sisters, and it will then eat its brother and sisters, as well as the other eggs within the womb, allowing one individual to get bigger. So when it's born, it's very large. It's an accomplished predator at that point. But this is very energy heavy for the female, so they only tend to mate every 2nd or 3rd year. So they're very low reproductive output. These sharks are born, we're not quite sure where they're born, maybe somewhere off of North Carolina or off of our coast. But when they're born, these very small sharks emigrate into our estuaries and use those as nursery grounds, preying on crabs, worms, and all sorts of little prey items that it can eat. There are 3 confirmed nursery grounds for sand tigers, one being up in Massachusetts, Duxbury Bay. That's one of my collaborators on one of my projects, Jeff Nebro, New England Aquarium, with a very small sand tiger pup. Great South Bay in Long Island, New York, was just confirmed as a sand tiger nursery ground by Wildlife Conservation Society, which is pictured here. And then we can also see very small sand tigers captured in Delaware Bay as well. I'll talk a little bit more about some smaller bays in New Jersey as nursery grounds as well. Once temperatures drop along the coast, these animals will then migrate down south as far as Florida, but they tend to dominate around North Carolina during the winter. So looking at this map here, you can see they move upwards during the summer months where they occupy the mid-Atlantic up through Cape Cod. And then during the winter months, they'll emigrate out and then go down south from North Carolina to Florida. And this is also supported by conventional tagging. So very strong seasonal migrations. This is some maps from satellite tagging information. So even though they are very, very coastal, they can sometimes occupy these kind of offshore areas as well, especially as they get much bigger in size. So the little ones tend to be in our shallower estuaries, and then the bigger ones can migrate further offshore. The sandbar shark is also another cosmopolitan species, meaning they occur on lots of different coasts, and this is considered one giant population as well. These sharks are very, very distinguishable amongst other sharks because they have a very large triangular fin as well as very large pectoral fins. But this is probably the biggest and most abundant coastal species that we see. They get very, very large, up to 8 feet in length, and very robust as well. But you will find them along all our coasts on the East Coast. These sharks also have very long maturity limits as well. Females mature around 13 years of age. Males are about 12 years of age, and gestation periods about 12 months as well. Females tend to have about 8 pups, And they're what we call viviparous. They give birth to live young here, they're very small. And they use a yolk sac placenta. So these very small sandbar sharks are born with a very small belly button or umbilical scar right in between the pectoral fins. So that's one of the ways we can confirm that sandbar sharks are giving birth in our shallow water estuaries. This is a very complicated map. This is from our NOAA um, Apex Angler program, but this shows all the different recaptures of sandbar sharks, which occur all along our coast as well as the Gulf of Mexico. This is also supported by various recaptures where we can see that during the spring, they're all the way up through Cape Cod, or they're moving up towards Cape Cod. The summer months, they're up north and along our coast. And then in the fall and winter, they kind of concentrate from North Carolina down around Florida as well. These sandbar sharks are born around 46 centimeters, so very, very small. And they tend to be born in some of the big estuaries like Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay, which are known as primary nurseries. And with those primary nurseries, they also utilize what we call secondary nurseries, and those are like the sharks are about 1 to 2 years of age that like to occupy these areas. These sharks, once they're in their natal estuaries or nursery estuaries, they don't move around that much. They tend to stay within these areas, particularly shallow water areas, because they too, at this age, are feeding on crabs, mollusks, polychaetes. So they want to occupy some of those smaller estuaries, seagrasses, and marshes in order to feed and grow very, very quickly in those nice, warm, shallow water habitats. So here's another example of various sharks tagged in a variety of different studies that show that they don't move around that much in these nursery areas because there's really no reason to move around that much when they have such an abundant prey resources. But as the winter comes around, these sharks start to emigrate out of the estuaries and move further down the coast, where they too become prey items or can become prey items for much larger sharks. And that can include larger sandbars, white sharks, sand tiger sharks, and some of the bigger species like bull sharks as well. So it's a shark eat shark world. And I thought I'd end on some of the shark species because these always get the most attention on white sharks. White sharks are very predominant around our coasts and coastlines. Particularly this year, we had a lot of showing around white sharks, but this map just shows you that white sharks are kind of global and move around our oceans very quickly. The Jersey coast is no stranger to white sharks, particularly in those early shark attacks that happened along our coast. Got lots and lots of press, and then it was also obviously materialized by this gentleman here, which is Frank Mundus, who was a New Jersey native or had a shark fishing business in New Jersey before moving up to Montauk, New York. And he's has the largest white shark ever captured by rod and reel, and he's thought to be the inspiration behind Quint and Jaws. So white sharks themselves are have always been around our coast in New Jersey. Here, looking at this map, we can see that this is satellite tagging data that was done. They're down in Florida during the winter, or down south during the winter time. During the spring, they start to move along our coast. In the summertime, they're mostly north, and in the fall, they move south. So that north-south migration again. but they can also move well offshore as well to occupy those areas. These sharks give birth to very big babies. The pups, when they're born, are about 5 foot and 77 pounds. And this is a unfortunate white shark that was captured off the coast of Taiwan, which showed 14 5-foot long white shark babies inside. So these babies are very, very big. Interesting fact, when these small juveniles are born, they don't have their big triangular teeth that they're known for yet. They have these very sharp, pointy teeth, just like sand tigers, where they eat squid and very small fish at this age. But the New Jersey coast is no stranger to these animals. This is a picture in the early 60s off of Sandy Hook, New Jersey, that shows these very small white shark pups off the coast. And looking at historic data, we can see incidences of little juveniles along our coast. This is again from Casey and Pratt in the 70s and 80s. And more recently, this was proven to be a white shark nursery off the coast of Long Island. They give birth somewhere off the coast of the Atlantic, and then these little juvenile white sharks are also utilizing the mid-Atlantic as their nursery areas, so feeding on lots of squid and fish and some of our abundant prey resources. So just to touch on some of the current research that we're going to be doing with the Nature Conservancy and our partner Rutgers, we're going to be evaluating the spatial and temporal use of our salt marshes and coastal bays as nursery grounds for our prohibited shark species, particularly our sandbar shark, which is pictured here, and our sand tiger sharks. So right here is a very small sand tiger that was recently born, and we know that because of this very small size. This was in Great Bay. So these little green dots that we picture here are acoustic receivers, and our general plan is to tag a variety of juvenile sharks, including sand tigers, sandbars, and smooth dogfish, and adults, and see how they move throughout our local bays and estuaries. As much as this is a small portion or area, we have acoustic receivers up and down the coast, so we can actually see their emigration out of these systems as well. Plus, we also have a couple hundred sharks tagged from collaborating institutions as well, so we can see all sorts of movements of sharks. And with that, I will pass it to Adrianna.
Thanks, Keith. That was a fantastic presentation on the range of New Jersey sharks. So I've spent the last 10 years working in New Jersey's coastal wetlands, and I was completely blown away when I first met Keith and saw for myself the variety of shark species that rely on New Jersey's back bays. And we're just really excited to be partnering with Keith, and we can't wait to learn more about their movements through your upcoming research. So really excited to see what those tags have to show us. So I had the privilege of joining Keith for a tagging event last year, and right from the marsh's edge, we're actually seeing a lot of these species. So it was really, really exciting and mind-blowing for me, even as an experienced coastal ecologist, to be, to see these species in action. So I wanted to, let's see, I have control now, right? Perfect. Okay. So I wanted to provide a little bit of background on New Jersey's coastal marshes as a backdrop for New Jersey, for our work in New Jersey on coastal wetlands. So just a really quick overview of salt marshes so you can appreciate how valuable and vulnerable these habitats are. So healthy salt marshes are some of the most productive habitats on Earth. They provide nesting areas for birds and diamondback terrapin, nurseries for marine fish, including sharks, as we just heard from Keith, and a rich food source for a variety of native, resident, and migratory species. 70% of the commercial fish, so that's fish that are important to us as people, depend on salt marshes for all or part of their lives. So they're really important ecosystems from a wildlife perspective. And in addition to seafood, salt marshes provide other benefits to our human communities. So coastal salt marshes act as a natural buffer to coastal communities. The grasses themselves that make up the salt marshes actually slow down wave action and reduce the power that waves have when they hit the shore. So the grasses are small but mighty. They provide a lot of drag and really can slow down water. You see in this infographic the difference in wave height with and without salt marshes, kind of there intervening. They also act as natural filters and sponges, removing pollutants from the water and providing habitat for a lot of animals that filter water and provide water clarity and reduce pollution. So we have a lot to owe for our coastal wetlands. Just a little bit of a look. Okay, so where are salt marshes? They line New Jersey's coast. So you may have seen salt marshes. They're low, flat, grassy expanses. You may have seen them from the Garden State Parkway or as you cross the bridge to vacation on Barrier Island. They're the kind of big, grassy in between. On the map, in the map on the left, you can see just the length of the full length of New Jersey's coastline, and the light blue demarcates the habitats that are our tidal wetlands. And so you see they line the Atlantic coast a little more heavily in the south and into Delaware Bay. Salt marshes are struggling. So there's several reasons for this. Marshes aren't just where grasses live. They're unique habitats because the grasses actually build their own habitat. They create the substrate. The marsh platform itself is built by grasses for grasses. The grass leaves actually, as it slows down water, it causes sand and mud that are suspended in the water. It's what makes our coastal waters brown. That sand and mud settles out to the root system and helps build the marsh in elevation over time. Additionally, they have really complex root systems. So they form peat, which is a really thick organic layer that has a lot of stability. So when a salt marsh is living and supported by living grasses, it's building vertically and it's holding itself together. The salt marsh grasses are also very vulnerable because they have a very narrow growth range relative to the tide. They can handle being underwater for portions of the day, high tide in particular. Water comes into the marsh, it overtops the grasses, and then it recedes, and the grasses can continue to reach sunlight and grow. With impacts of climate change, we're seeing higher, more persistent, longer periods of time that these salt marsh grasses are underwater. And that's causing the grasses to struggle. We'll see a decline in their growth and eventually their death. So this is in the upper right here, if you can see my cursor, this is a flooded salt marsh. Sometimes they get even more overtopped. If the water stays there for too long, these plants will eventually die. And we start to see big interior dips and areas with large amounts of vegetation die off. As the plants die, they were literally holding the marsh together. So as those plants are dying, the sediment is getting washed back out and away. So it's kind of reached this threshold and it's continuing to lose elevation. So it kind of reaches that tipping point. And if that's happening at the edge, the plants aren't there to stabilize the edge and hold it together. With boat wakes or storm waves, we're actually seeing the marsh fall apart from the edge as well. So it's death by 1,000 cuts, and what the reasons that salt marshes are struggling in the face of climate change. Obviously, that's unacceptable. So what are we doing about it? So the Conservancy and many other conservation organizations are working together to develop nature-based restoration techniques. So really following nature's lead, taking the hints from nature, and coming up with coastal management strategies and coastal restoration strategies that are scalable, but work with nature. And so those are techniques that maintain connection between lands and waters, so we don't like barriers or walls. Obviously, fish passage, including sharks coming in and out, we have to maintain that natural land-sea interface for water and for wildlife. Natural systems can recover more quickly from disturbance. If they're biotically based, they have that natural resilience built in. And then also retaining the benefits of these natural habitats, all of those values that I listed for salt marshes. Working with nature allows us to retain and enhance a lot of those natural benefits. And so as two examples, this got a little goofy, but you can see an example of edge stabilization here in the lower left. I tried to pair what nature does with the restoration technique that's a complement. So mussels are gluing themselves to the base of stems, that's where they like to live, of marsh grasses. And so they're holding that line very physically. So the roots of the grasses are holding the marsh edge together, and the mussels are adding kind of their power to that edge stabilization. So a complementary restoration technique is to add bagged oyster shell against the edge of an eroding area of vegetation, and that slows down the water, it adds elevation, and the plants are actually starting to root inside those shell backs, similar to the mussels. So even though we're the ones that place the shell there, we're still seeing a complementary natural benefit. This is at a really small scale and in a technique called living shorelines. And what we're focusing on now from we want to protect as much marsh as possible, as quickly as possible, because they don't have a lot of time. This other technique, we're looking at mimicking natural sand deposits that happen with storms. So when winter storms or nor'easters come into a system, they move a bunch of sediment around. So they move it in from the inlets, they move it from marshes. And as that water comes in on a storm surge, it brings a lot of sediment, a lot of mud and sand with it. And so in this upper right picture, you can see a natural sand deposit on the surface of a marsh. And that's been left there by a single storm in one fell swoop. It's about a foot of material all of a sudden. And we can mimic that by working with our navigation partners who maintain our local boating channels, the navigational channels like the Intercoastal Waterway and our state managed channels. They have to clear a lot of that mud and sand out of their channels to maintain safe boating. And they need somewhere to put that material. Traditionally, they've been taking it out of the system and putting it in landfills. And now we're working with them to beneficially reuse that material and put it back on the platform of the marshes, kind of like what the storms do on their own. That is, of course, much more challenging to do than just to say, but we're working on all fronts to accomplish this scalable restoration. So we have a goal at the Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, to work to restore and sustain 1,000 acres of salt marsh by 2030. So I'm pretty busy, my colleagues and I, trying to get this done and focusing on saving as much marsh as we can, as fast as we can. Obviously, we're not going to stop at 1,000 acres, but we're doing that with on-the-ground projects. We're doing that across the state using a variety of tools and scientific data to figure out where the marshes are in most need and where that lines up with these dredging needs, so that we can really make this a straightforward practice and as economically feasible as possible. So there's a lot of efforts that we're doing to plan strategically looking across the state. And then we're also working with our regulatory community and our decision makers to make sure that there are policies and regulations that allow for and potentially even incentivize these types of restoration techniques so that we can continue to sustain these valuable tidal waters and coastal habitats on which we all depend. And I think at that, I'm ready to hand it back over to Lily.
Awesome. Thank you so much both for that amazing presentation. It looks like we have about 12 to 14 minutes left, and we are going to open up the floor to some questions. So Dr. Dunton or Adrianna, feel free to chime in if you hear something that is relevant to you. So let's see here. Okay. Do you have any recommended dive sites for shark viewing?
I do not have any recommended sites for shark diving around New Jersey. I'm a fairly new New Jersey resident, so 7 years or so. But I would imagine that there are some of the offshore wrecks would probably have good things like sand tigers and sandbars, which are dominant spots for them during the summer months.
Let's see, we have another one here for you. Do hurricanes have any effect on sharks' migration?
Hurricanes have many effects on many fish species, particularly because it's a low pressure system, and a lot of fish can actually detect the low pressure as well as the heavy wave action. So in many cases, a lot of fish species in general go offshore during hurricanes and then come inshore. I don't know for sure, but there have been studies in like Florida Bay that have shown sharks actually leave these shallower systems during hurricanes and then come back in. And that's they found that using some of the acoustic tagging technologies that we've had. So they probably notice it.
Adriana, typically how long does it take for the marsh grasses to root and start growing from the oyster bags?
We saw it within a growing season. So I'm sure it varies site to site, but at the site in Delaware Bay, which is at a 6-foot tide, we saw really rapid rooting. These grasses spread by rhizomes, so they actually shoot out their roots across the surface. So very quickly they encountered the bags and were able to colonize them. So it was a really exciting opportunity to restore the edge.
Okay, let's see here. While you were going over the current research with the Nature Conservancy and Rutgers, you mentioned prohibited species. What do you mean by this?
Prohibited species are species that NOAA says that we cannot harvest. So usually when you encounter a prohibited species, you're supposed to leave it. If you're a fisherman that encounters a prohibited species, you're supposed to release it in a manner that best increases their survival. So you should leave it in the water, dehook it, or cut the line close to its mouth and send it on its way. So the prohibited species that we most encounter in New Jersey are the sandbar and sand tiger shark, meaning we can't harvest them commercially or for our own to eat.
Let's see, this one looks like it's for you, Adriana. Are wetlands and salt marshes the same thing?
Yes and no. So wetland is a very generic term. It means any place that land and water coexist. And so salt marshes are a very specific type of wetland dominated by salty or water, brackish water.
I believe this is for you, Dr. Dunton. What are polychaetes?
Polychaetes are worms that we encounter a lot in the salt marshes and estuaries. They're segmented worms. You might know them as clam worms or blood worms or worms with many feet or many legs on their side.
Awesome, thank you. And what is the cause of the 90% decline in the sand tigers population? Is it overfishing?
It was previously overfishing or encounters as bycatch. If you remember, I mentioned that they only give birth to one pup every couple years. So it's you can quickly knock down a population that has such a slow recovery time, and particularly when you harvested them or they were encountered in other fishing nets. So non-target species.
Let's see here. If you encounter a beach shark, what is the best and safest way to help them back into the water?
A beach shark. That's an interesting one. um, uh, you should always keep in mind your safety versus the shark safety because it's very easily you can very easily get bit. But most of the fishermen that encounter sharks when they capture them on a line will dehook them and grab them by the tail or back end to keep a safe distance, and you can maneuver them back into the water and kind of twist them around when you do that.
Okay. Do bull sharks use our estuaries as nurseries too?
Bull sharks have been shown to use areas like Chesapeake Bay to lay their pups as well, especially small ones. We do encounter some bull sharks along the New Jersey and New York coast, but there are a lot more rarer species to be encountering in this area.
Okay.
Every now and then you hear one being captured.
Could we be scared to swim in New Jersey's waters because of sharks?
No, not at all. Massachusetts runs a really good campaign called Shark Smart, or Smart Shark or something like that. As long as you are following the rules of like don't be swimming in schools of fish along the shore, try to not swim at dawn and dusk, which are primary feeding times of sharks. If you see a fin in the water, leave. So as long as you're aware of your surroundings, but sharks are along our coast in very large numbers all the time. They sense us before we sense them. And especially the species that we encounter are not species that would want to eat us or bite us purposely.
Okay. And this is kind of a follow-up to that question. Can you explain why a shark attack isn't really an attack?
Well, we don't call them shark attacks, so we call them shark encounters. Because attack is like something purposeful. In most cases, it's just a misidentification, particularly at like a dawn or dusk scenario, or where the water is not as clear as it can be. So sharks use a variety of senses to find their prey items. As you imagine, the ocean, eyesight is probably the last one that they would use because they use electromagnetic reception. They can smell and do all sorts of things. So typically, when there is an incident, it's typically one exploratory bite, and then they tend to leave.
And how many total types of sharks are in New Jersey coastal areas?
How many types of sharks in coastal? Too many to count, but we do have a lot of shark species along our coast. But the primary ones in our coastal systems, like where we've encountered them in bays and estuaries and maybe surf fishing, would be the sandbar, sand tiger, smooth dogfish, spiny dogfish, and then to a lesser extent, things like black tips, spinners, hammerheads, where we might encounter them close to shore.
And this one seems like it could be a good question for both of you. What kind of resources are useful for learning more about sharks and ocean and wetland ecosystems? That could be databases, books, any websites that you would recommend.
There's lots of resources to learn about sharks. There's numerous books that you could read. Maybe I can come up with a list to recommend. But there's lots and lots of resources. My only suggestion would be try to find the right resources, especially if you're looking online. Look for like state or federal government or educational institutions, and not like random websites that you might encounter.
I would echo the make sure you have a credible resource recommendation. I think within New Jersey, I have a great appreciation, having worked in the Keys and then the Carolinas and now New Jersey, how variable tidal wetlands are based on tide range, and there's a lot of overlap, but enough differences that you can target New Jersey or mid-Atlantic coastal wetlands if you're interested in learning specifically about the wetlands nearest you. I've certainly learned a lot from Louisiana, but I don't try to pretend that our growth range is the same, things like that. New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection produced a great technical report that's very science heavy, but they have a great executive summary. So I can share that link with Lily if we're going to do a follow-up. And NOAA has a bunch of different great resources on wetlands, especially from the community protection and coastal resilience side, that have been a great resource for me in my work. So I'll get some of those links to Lily and have them transferred to our participants. It's a great question.
Yes, thank you, Adriana. I was going to follow up with that. Like I said in the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending out a follow-up email sometime next week, and we'll be sure to include a few links to some of these suggested resources here. So it looks like we have a couple more minutes. We'll just take a few more questions and then we will wrap it up. Adriana, how do you engage the public with these coastal how do you engage the public of these coastal salt marsh towns to care about the marshes?
Well, I think we always have room to improve. We could always do more engagement in education. I think one of the successful techniques that we've had so far is helping understand and communicate the multiple values of our coastal wetlands. And so understanding that every community has different challenges and that wetlands rank differently with the different communities that we're engaging with. I think the approach is different with each community, and we start by listening. And then meet them where we are. If they have concerns about flooding, if they have rich ecotourism, really meeting our communities and our leaders where they are and listening, and then helping kind of match our goals together, I think has been a successful strategy. And working with other education partners, the Wetlands Institute in Stone Harbor has been a really great project partner with education in their mission, and they do a lot of outreach down in the Cape May area, and I know that there's comparable partners throughout the state. So that's been a really great strategy as well. We don't have to pretend we can do it all ourselves. Leveraging our partners and their skill set has been a useful strategy and a great way to leverage resources.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And it looks like we have one more question here. Let's see. How do you feel about drones being used to patrol sharks visiting the waters off of the beaches that people often visit?
Drones are being used to monitor sharks, particularly in areas like Long Island. It's a tool, and it's an available tool that can be readily, easily used to look and search for sharks. But there are lots of sharks around, especially during the summertime months. So it wouldn't be unsurprising to see something. The only thing wrong with drones in our coastal systems is that they could impact shorebirds like piping plovers breeding or something like that. So it's obviously a balance of things when using a tool like that.
I was going to add responsible piloting is important, and appropriate permits. I think we've seen a lot of amazing scientific data, even on marsh vegetation extent, that can be collected by drones. So really doing that collaboratively and responsibly, I think it's a great cost-effective tool.
Awesome. Well, thank you again both so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, so if anyone has any lingering questions, please feel free to email us and we will do our best to respond. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We will be sending out a link to the recording as well as some resources sometime next week. And as always, thank you for your continued support of the Nature Conservancy. Have a great day, everyone.